Nestled amidst the rolling hills and picturesque landscapes of Colorado, lies the quaint little town of Riverside. At first glance, the town seems like a slice of Americana come to life, with its white picket fences, tree-lined streets, and a main square complete with a vintage clock tower. Life here moves at a slower, soothing pace. The local diner, Rosie's Kitchen, is the heart of the town, where everyone from retirees to school kids gathers for a comforting plate of pancakes or a slice of home-baked pie. Riverside is the kind of place where neighbors know each other's names, where doors are left unlocked, and the most scandalous piece of gossip might be someone's dog running loose through the local park. It's peaceful, serene, and to many, a paradise untouched by time and turmoil. But like many small towns, Riverside has its share of stories. Whispered tales of long-forgotten feuds, unsolved mysteries, and quiet heartbreaks hidden beneath its sunny facade. Life here, while seemingly idyllic, is far from perfect. Beneath the surface, people carry secrets, some mundane, others darker than one might imagine. And this facade of calm was shattered one fateful morning, sending shockwaves through the community and revealing cracks beneath the town's seemingly flawless exterior. When the lifeless body of Emily Sanders was discovered on the outskirts of town, the sleepy streets of Riverside were awash with fear, speculation, and disbelief. Emily wasn't just another resident, she was, in a way, a symbol of the new Riverside. Young, vibrant, and beautiful, she had moved from the bustling city in search of the tranquility and charm that small-town life promised. For a time it seemed like she had embraced everything Riverside had to offer. But in hindsight, her life, and subsequent death, proved that even the calmest waters can hide treacherous depths. What is it about small towns like Riverside that makes their secrets so potent? Perhaps it's the claustrophobia of being so closely knit, where privacy is a luxury and everyone knows everyone else's business, or at least they think they do. Or maybe it's the stark contrast between the perfection on the outside and the tangled, messy lives within. Whatever it is, in Riverside, the glittering pastures and quaint storefronts became the set of a tale far darker than anyone could have imagined. The town's collective innocence was lost the moment Emily's body was found, and no one knew how to piece it back together. Riverside would never be the same. What was once a haven of peace now had its name splashed across news headlines, whispered in conversations far and wide, a stain that no amount of nostalgia could erase. Questions loomed: who could have done this? Why? And, most hauntingly, how could this have happened in a place like Riverside? A place where evil seemed as out of place as a storm on a clear day. It was an ordinary, crisp autumn morning in Riverside. The kind of day when the air feels just sharp enough to remind you that winter is around the corner. The sun had just started peeking over the horizon, casting golden hues over the quiet streets and open fields. Delivery driver Mike Rowland had been making his usual rounds, humming along to a country tune playing on the radio as he navigated his rusty old pickup truck down the meandering back roads that led to the outskirts of town. Mike had driven this route 100 times before, the landscape so familiar to him he swore he could do it blindfolded. But that day was different. Something caught his eye near the edge of a clearing. A strange shape sprawled on the side of the dirt road, barely visible through the morning mist. At first he thought it might be a deer, perhaps struck by a passing car. But as he slowed the truck, a gnawing pit of unease crept into his stomach. Stepping out, boots crunching against the frost-dusted grass, he edged closer until the terrifying realization hit him like a freight train. It wasn't a deer at all. It was a person. The body belonged to Emily Sanders, lying cold and unmistakably lifeless in the dim morning light. Her once vibrant face was pale, her expression eerily serene as though caught in a final moment of uneasy rest. She wore a sleeveless dress, the hem dirtied from the ground, but curiously she was missing any clothing from the waist down. Oddly, the scene lacked any obvious signs of a struggle. There were no scuffed footprints, no disturbed earth, no trail leading to or away from the site. It was as if she had simply appeared there, placed with intention and precision. What stood out most was the faint mark on her neck, a shallow red band suggesting someone had gripped it tightly, though not tightly enough to end her life. Mike didn't need to be a detective to know something was horribly wrong. He stepped back, muffling a gasp, and frantically fumbled for his phone to call the police. As the line rang, the delivery driver could only watch helplessly, feeling like he was intruding on a scene meant to remain hidden. By the time Sheriff Dillon arrived on the scene, news of the grisly discovery had already begun to spread like wildfire. Riverside wasn't the kind of place where dark happenings stayed under wraps for long. A handful of curious onlookers had managed to find their way to the outskirts, whispering among themselves, their faces pale with disbelief. Dylan immediately called for the coroner, demanding a full forensic team be dispatched. Years of experience told him there was more to this than met the eye, and the meticulous way the scene appeared untouched only deepened his suspicion. As the investigation officially began, whispers and speculation began to ripple through the town. Some wondered whether Emily had fallen victim to a drifter passing through, while others pointed fingers closer to home, scrutinizing the more shadowy corners of their close-knit community. One thing was certain: Emily's death, so mysterious and cruelly abrupt, was a dark cloud hanging over a town that prided itself on simplicity and safety. The truth was out there somewhere, embedded in the chilling details of that crime scene: the missing clothes, the faint marks, the eerie sense of careful staging. As forensic experts combed through every inch of the area, Sheriff Dylan couldn't shake a gut feeling that this was only the tip of a much darker and more tangled web. One thing was for sure: the discovery of Emily's body marked the end of Riverside's quiet naivety. Nothing in this once idyllic town would ever be the same again. Sheriff Nolan Dillon wasn't a man easily shaken. A towering figure in his late 50s, his salt-and-pepper hair and weathered face spoke of years spent grappling with the darker sides of human nature. With over 3 decades of law enforcement experience, Dillon had seen his fair share of tragedy. Accidents, scandals, even the occasional bout of violence. But this was something else. As he drove his old Crown Victoria down the dusty road toward the crime scene, he couldn't shake the unsettling feeling in his gut. Riverside was a small town, the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked. The discovery of Emily Sanders' body turned everything he thought he knew about his peaceful community upside down. When Dillon arrived, the scene had already drawn a small crowd of curious onlookers. He stepped out of his car, his scuffed boots hitting the dirt road with purpose. A hush spread through the group as they noticed him approach, his sharp blue eyes fixed on the body ahead. He waved at Deputy Taylor to keep the gathering townsfolk at bay, knowing full well how gossip could spread in a place like Riverside. "Keep them back," Dillon said gruffly, pulling on a pair of latex gloves. "I don't want this site compromised any more than it already is." The first thing Dillon noticed about Emily Sanders' body was how oddly serene it looked. It was staged. He was sure of it. Over the years he'd developed an almost sixth sense for crime scenes. Looking at Emily lying there, he could tell that whoever had done this wasn't just careless or impulsive. They'd taken their time. He crouched down next to her, his hand hovering inches above the faint red line around her neck. Too faint to suggest strangulation, but clearly deliberate. "Whoever did this wanted us to find her," Dillon muttered under his breath. "What was that, Sheriff?" Taylor asked, stepping closer with a notebook in hand. Dillon shook his head, standing up and surveying the area. "Nothing, just thinking out loud." He squinted into the distance, his sharp eyes scanning the tree line and the open field beyond. There were no clear footprints, no drag marks leading to or from the scene. It was as if Emily had simply materialized there. That in itself told Dillon quite a bit. This wasn't random, it wasn't reckless, it was calculated. "Mike Rowland was the one who found her?" Dillon asked. "Yes, Sheriff," Taylor confirmed. "He's still over there by his truck if you want to talk to him." Dillon approached Mike, who looked as pale as a ghost, nervously gripping the bill of his baseball cap and avoiding eye contact. Mike was a good guy, dependable, honest, a bit clumsy at times, but not the kind to mess with anything like this. Still, it was Dillon's job to ask. "Mike," Dillon started, his voice calm and steady, "walk me through what you saw." Mike took a shaky breath, the words tumbling out in pieces. He described the strange silhouette through the morning mist, how he'd thought it was a deer at first, and the cold dread that gripped him when he got closer. Dillon listened intently, occasionally jotting notes on a small notepad he kept in his shirt pocket. "You didn't touch anything?" Dillon asked, his tone firm but not accusing. "No, sir," Mike said quickly, shaking his head. "Didn't go near her once I saw, well, you know." He gestured vaguely toward the body. Satisfied that Mike didn't have anything more to add, Dillon returned to the scene, where the coroner was now examining the body with a meticulous gaze. A light breeze rustled the trees, carrying the faint scent of decay. It was a stark contrast to the otherwise crisp autumn air. Dillon folded his arms and watched as the coroner worked, his mind racing with questions. Who would want Emily Sanders dead? She was young, vibrant, and despite her recent marital troubles, she didn't exactly seem like the kind of person to invite enemies. But Dillon knew better than to take things at face value. In a town like Riverside, secrets had a way of burrowing deep. Everyone liked to pretend they were living picture-perfect lives, but Dillon knew better. In his line of work he'd learned that there was no such thing as perfect people, just carefully built illusions. "Sheriff!" the coroner called out, standing up and wiping his hands on a rag. "There's something unusual here." "What's that?" Dylan asked, stepping closer. "The marks on her neck. They weren't deep enough to strangle her. Something else killed her. We'll know for sure once the toxicology report comes in, but my guess? There's poison involved." The revelation hit Dylan like a punch to the stomach. Poison. That meant premeditation. Whoever killed Emily hadn't done it in a fit of rage. They'd planned it, carefully, deliberately. Dylan clenched his jaw, the gears in his mind turning faster now. "All right," he said, addressing his team. "We're locking this place down. No one comes in or out without my say-so. And I want a full forensic sweep of the area. Tire tracks, footprints, fibers, anything. I don't care how small it is. If it seems out of place, I want to know about it." As his deputies sprang into action, Dylan took a step back, taking one last look at Emily's lifeless form. She was someone's daughter, someone's friend. Maybe not perfect, maybe not without her flaws, but she didn't deserve this. No one did. Dylan knew this case wasn't going to be an easy one. He could feel it in his bones. This wasn't just about solving a murder. This was about unraveling a web of deceit and uncovering the truth hiding beneath Riverside's charming facade. As he lit up a cigarette, a habit he'd been meaning to kick for years, Dylan let out a slow exhale and muttered to himself, "Looks like this town's secrets are finally catching up to it." Emily Sanders wasn't just another face in Riverside. She was a spark in a town that treasured consistency and routine. When she first arrived 3 years ago, she wasn't anyone's idea of a small-town girl. With her city-polished style, sleek blonde hair, and an effervescent charm that could light up any room, Emily turned heads wherever she went. To the older folks she was a curious mystery. To the younger crowd she was nothing short of magnetic. Emily came to Riverside searching for something her city life hadn't given her. Peace, maybe, or perhaps roots. No one could say for sure, not even the friends who thought they knew her best. Emily claimed she wanted to escape the noise and chaos of urban living, trading taxis and skyscrapers for quiet streets and sunsets over open fields. But Emily wasn't the kind of woman who blended in. In a town like Riverside, where people prided themselves on humility and keeping their noses out of trouble, Emily stood out like a Hollywood star on a backroad stage. Almost as soon as she arrived, all of Riverside was caught up in her whirlwind. At the local farmers market, she lingered by the flower stands, chatting effortlessly with vendors. At Rosie's Kitchen, she always sat at a corner booth, sipping coffee and offering her radiant smile to anyone who passed by. But as much as people adored Emily's charm, there was a subtle layer of envy, discomfort even, beneath their adoration. She wasn't like them, and that spark of difference became both her allure and, eventually, her peril. It wasn't long before Emily met Joe Miller, the handsome but reserved son of the Millers, one of the wealthiest and most prominent families in Riverside. Joe was a carpenter and mill worker, known for keeping to himself and never making waves. Emily, in contrast, was bold, opinionated, and unafraid of confrontation. But opposites attract, as they say, and Emily captured Joe's attention with what seemed like effortless ease. Their whirlwind romance quickly became the talk of the town. At first, their coupling felt like a fairy tale. The beautiful outsider sweeping the local boy off his feet, the wealthy Miller name giving Emily a place in Riverside's upper crust. They were married within a year, and for a fleeting moment, Riverside embraced Emily as one of their own. But the honeymoon phase didn't last long. Emily's bold, vibrant personality began to clash with the unspoken rules of small-town life, especially within the Miller household. The Millers were old school, priding themselves on decorum and tradition. Emily's sharp wit and fiery spirit didn't sit well with Joe's mother, Sarah, a matriarch who believed in order and propriety above all else. There were whispers in town that Emily's marriage to Joe was doomed from the start. While Joe was quiet and reserved, Emily was a head-turner, always at the center of attention whether she wanted to be or not. Their differences started as minor frictions but soon grew into full-blown arguments, noticeable even to their friends and neighbors. Emily also didn't shy away from voicing her frustrations about the suffocating expectations placed on her as a Miller wife. She was seen rolling her eyes at social events where other women quietly deferred to their husbands. Rumors circulated that she was blowing through Joe's money faster than he could earn it, spoiling herself with designer clothes and weekend trips to Denver while refusing to take part in Riverside's modest, grounded lifestyle. These things earned her more critics than allies, but Emily wasn't just misunderstood, she was complicated. She had a way of drawing people in but also burning bridges just as quickly. Her close friends described her as fiercely loyal and magnetic, someone who could make you feel like the most interesting person in the room. But they also admitted, behind closed doors, that she could be manipulative, using her charm to navigate situations to her favor. Some admired her boldness, others thought it was arrogance. Then there was the talk of Emily's restlessness. People had seen her at the local bars, sometimes in heated conversations with men who weren't Joe. Whispers of infidelity began to circulate, though none of the gossip could be proven. Behind her dazzling smile, it seemed Emily might have been unsatisfied with the life she signed up for in Riverside, or perhaps she felt trapped in a marriage that wasn't what she had envisioned. But Emily was good at keeping up appearances, at least for the most part. When the marriage finally started to unravel, it was like watching a storm roll in over a clear sky. Emily and Joe entered a period of separation just weeks before her death, with Emily moving out of their shared home but staying on the Miller property. Even in the middle of their troubles, it was clear they couldn't completely let go of one another. Joe, always quiet and subdued, began showing signs of stress to those who knew him, retreating further into his work at the sawmill. Emily, on the other hand, seemed determined not to let anyone see her falter. She maintained her polished composure, smiling that same radiant smile, but people could tell it didn't reach her eyes the way it used to. When Emily's body was found, it shattered any illusions about her life in Riverside. To the outside world, she had appeared glamorous and carefree, but the darker whispers that had swirled around her couldn't be ignored. There was tension, baggage, and layers of mystery that even her closest confidants couldn't untangle. Emily was more than just a beautiful face or a troubled young woman. She was a symbol of Riverside's quiet dysfunction, an outsider who refused to conform, whose death would bring the town's buried secrets clawing to the surface. And as Sheriff Dillon would soon discover, Emily's life, and her untimely death, embodied something much more sinister than meets the eye. In her pursuit of a dream, Emily had unknowingly walked into a nightmare, and now the question on everyone's mind was, who had reason enough to take her life and why? Joe Miller was the kind of man who blended into the background, a quiet figure in a town that thrived on keeping things simple. Born and raised in Riverside, Joe lived most of his life in the shadow of his prominent family name. The Millers, known for their wealth and influence, owned half the town, from the sawmill that employed a chunk of Riverside's working-class men to several key properties lining Main Street. But while Joe's family loomed large, he had always been determined to live humbly, avoiding the limelight and the expectations that came with his last name. At first glance, Joe seemed the polar opposite of Emily Sanders, his vivacious and city-slicker wife, where Emily radiated energy and demanded attention in every room she entered. Joe was reserved, the kind of man comfortable being unnoticed. He was a craftsman at heart, happiest when working long days with his hands at the sawmill or whittling little trinkets out of wood in the corner of his quiet workshop. His life revolved around simplicity, routines, and an aversion to drama. But Emily took all that simplicity and flipped it on its head. Their romance, quick and passionate, had made them the talk of Riverside. Many believed Joe had fallen for Emily because she was everything he wasn't. Vibrant, unafraid, and unapologetic. She brought light into his otherwise steady, subdued world, and for a while, it seemed like a match that balanced them both. But soon after their marriage, cracks began to show. Emily's bold personality didn't sit well with the Millers, especially Joe's mother Sarah, a sharp-tongued matriarch who ruled the family with firm expectations. Joe had always been his mother's pride. Despite his quiet demeanor, he was dependable, a product of the Miller upbringing. So when Sarah saw Emily, brash, dazzling, and a bit too flashy by small-town standards, enter the family, she was less than pleased. As tension grew between Emily and Sarah, Joe often found himself caught in the middle, tasked with keeping the peace in a situation where no one seemed interested in compromise. That middle ground became more and more fraught, with Joe retreating into silence and Emily raging against the expectations placed on her as a Miller wife. Outsiders loved to speculate, and they had plenty of material. Some would say Joe was too passive, unable to meet Emily's fire with his own voice. Others blamed Emily entirely, calling her an outsider who never bothered to understand the rhythms of a small-town life. But beneath the judgment and small-town gossip, there was also undeniable truth. Joe and Emily's relationship was a storm waiting to happen. It wasn't long before arguments spilled out from behind closed doors, sometimes loud enough for the neighbors to hear through the quiet suburban evenings. Trouble hit its peak when the rumors about Emily's restlessness started circulating. She was spotted more than once at the bar, often deep in hushed emotional conversations with men who weren't Joe. There was whispering about infidelity, though nothing ever proved concrete. Joe, for his part, said nothing, but his face told a story of its own, more withdrawn, more tense, with the weight of those whispers leaving its mark over time. Emily had her own stories to spread, confiding in close friends that she felt trapped, stifled by both Joe's quiet nature and the suffocating outlook of the Miller family. It all painted a picture of a marriage straining under its own weight, and then there was the separation. Just weeks before Emily's death, it seemed enough had finally been enough. Emily moved out of the home she'd shared with Joe, though not far enough to truly get away. She stayed in one of the guest houses on the Miller estate, a choice that caused more speculation than clarity. Some thought her decision to stick around showed she still cared for Joe, even if things were rocky. Others believed she was milking Joe's family resources for all they were worth. The story changed depending on whom you asked. Emily's death brought all those buried tensions into the harsh light of day. For many in Riverside, the most obvious suspect was Joe. After all, he was the husband. Naturally, suspicion fell his way. Neighbors talked about the visible strain in his marriage, how he would go days without being seen around town during particularly heated patches. Joe's alibi for the morning Emily's body was discovered was solid enough. He claimed to be working in the sawmill, a statement backed by a handful of employees on the property. Despite this, whispers about Joe's involvement refused to fade away. The most damning pieces of gossip weren't about where Joe was when Emily died, but rather during their marriage. To the people of Riverside, his reserved nature wasn't just shyness, it was repressed anger waiting for release. Those who had heard Joe's voice raised during arguments with Emily spoke about the quiet man's capacity to explode under pressure. Even his closest friends admitted that while Joe was calm by nature, no one could honestly claim to know the darker thoughts he might carry behind those walls of silence. But Sheriff Dillon was hesitant to let the town's assumptions steer his investigation. Joe wasn't just a suspect, he was a man grieving the loss of someone he had once loved deeply, no matter how messy things had become. Dillon could see the weariness in Joe's eyes when they sat down for questioning, the way he rubbed his calloused hands together as though trying to ground himself. "Sheriff, I swear I'd never hurt Emily," Joe said during one of their first conversations, his voice low and steady. Things weren't great, that's true, but she didn't deserve this." Dillon believed Joe was telling the truth, at least the parts he could bear to admit. But belief wasn't proof. There were still too many unanswered questions about Joe's role in Emily's life, and in her death. Why had he allowed her to stay on his family's property after their separation? Why hadn't he fought harder to fix the marriage, given how deeply she seemed to unsettle his carefully ordered life? And perhaps most damning, why had Emily told a confidant shortly before her death that she feared someone close to her could hurt her? For Joe, Emily's death was more than a tragedy, it was the unshakable weight of loss entwined with suspicion. In the eyes of Riverside, he was a man struggling to come to terms with a relationship gone horribly wrong. But in the eyes of Dillon, he was a puzzle. A quiet, complicated figure whose intentions remained maddeningly unclear. Riverside was not a town where secrets stayed buried for long, but sometimes the truth didn't emerge until someone finally broke the silence. Days into the investigation, just as the trail on Emily Sanders' mysterious death seemed to cool, Sheriff Dillon received a call from a nervous neighbor whose words would ripple through the already shaken town like a flash flood. Her name was Linda Cooper, an older widow who lived near the edge of the Miller property line. Linda was the kind of woman who knew how to stay invisible. Never too loud at church luncheons, never too meddlesome in town gossip, yet never quite removed enough to miss anything happening around her. She'd never thought of herself as the nosy type, but what she had seen and heard over the weeks leading up to Emily's death was impossible to ignore. Now, sitting across from Sheriff Dillon in the stark, no-nonsense office of the Riverside Police Department, Linda finally confessed to something that had been gnawing at her conscience. "I hesitated to come forward," she began, her voice wavering while her thin hands gripped the edge of her purse. "But I can't stop thinking about what I saw. I know it might be incriminating." Dillon leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady and cautious. He had interviewed enough witnesses over the years to know when someone was about to give him a bombshell. "Take your time, ma'am," he said, softening his gruff demeanor. "This is about finding the truth and nothing else." Linda took a shaky breath before the words spilled out. "I think Emily was having an affair with someone in the Miller family." That one sentence shifted the air in the room. Dylan's eyes narrowed slightly, his mind immediately racing through the implications. An affair? Emily's life, already shadowed by her troubled marriage, was now tangled in even deeper intrigue. "Someone in the Miller family?" Dylan asked carefully, lowering his voice as if speaking too loudly might break the moment. "Linda, are you sure? Who?" Linda hesitated, visibly uncomfortable with what she was about to share. "I'm not sure I should say. It's just something I noticed, but I think it was William Miller." William Miller, the patriarch of the Miller family. To the residents of Riverside, William was more than Joe's father. He was one of the town's most influential and wealthiest men, but he also carried a reputation for being, as some discreetly put it, a man of indulgences. There had always been whispers of his affairs. Women from neighboring towns, freshly hired housemaids, and even younger socialites who attended fundraisers with ambition in their eyes. But to think he might have crossed the line with his own daughter-in-law, the thought was both grotesque and explosive. "What makes you think that, Linda?" Dylan said, keeping his voice measured, though inside he felt his gut twist. "Well," Linda started, her eyes darting nervously around the room, "I'd see them, sometimes, at the edge of the property. They'd meet near the big oak tree off the main house. It wasn't just friendly. The way they stood together, the way they talked, there was something more. Something I can't really explain but just knew wasn't right." Dylan nodded, encouraging her to continue. "Did you hear anything? See anything more specific?" Linda's face flushed, as if trying to figure out how much detail she should admit to. "One night, maybe 2 weeks before poor Emily was found." She paused, visibly struggling with the memory. "I couldn't sleep. I was out on my porch and I saw them again near the guest house. I couldn't hear the words, but William, I mean." He grabbed her arm, hard. It wasn't the first time. She pulled away from him like she was angry, upset, and then she said something. I couldn't catch it all, but it sounded like, "I'm not keeping this quiet anymore." Dylan felt a chill creep up his spine. If her words were true, it added an entirely new layer of complexity to Emily's already chaotic life. Could this have been the secret that led to her murder? And could William, an untouchable figure in Riverside's social hierarchy, have been acting out of desperation to silence her? Linda wasn't done yet. "One other thing, Sheriff," she added, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "There've been nights when my dog gets restless, you know? And one night, after that argument with Emily, about a week before she—" Linda bit her lip before continuing. "I swear I saw William again. He was outside, pacing by her guest house. I don't know what he was doing, but something about it, I don't know, it felt off." Of course, Dylan knew better than to take a single account as gospel truth, but Linda's testimony, vague as it was, painted a damning picture. If Emily had threatened to expose something about her relationship with William, it could easily be motive for murder. And if William had been lurking around that guest house in the days leading up to Emily's death, it was no longer just speculation. It was a lead. "Linda, you've been incredibly brave for coming forward," Dylan said, sliding his notepad to the edge of the desk. "I know this can't be easy for you, especially given the people involved." Linda nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I just needed to do what felt right. Emily didn't deserve this, whatever happened to her." As Linda left the station, Dylan leaned back in his chair, staring at the notes he had jotted down. William Miller. If the man had ties to Emily's life beyond the usual strained dynamics of a father and daughter-in-law, this took his investigation in a whole new direction. To the outside world, William had the perfect life, wealth, power, and a family that seemed untouchable. But the cracks were becoming more visible with every passing day. Dylan let out a heavy sigh, already dreading the confrontation to come. If William's something to hide, he wouldn't be the type to fold easily. No, someone like that would fight tooth and nail to protect his reputation, no matter the cost. And in a place like Riverside, where small-town alliances and secrets ran deep, Dylan understood that taking on a man like William Miller could have consequences far beyond the case. One thing was certain, the town's web of secrets had just gotten more tangled, and at its center was a patriarch no one dared to challenge. Until now. From the moment Linda Cooper's testimony pointed to William Miller, Sheriff Dylan's investigation took a sharp and uncomfortable turn. William wasn't just another resident of Riverside, he was resident. The old man whose family name practically owned the town. Wealthy, influential, and deeply entrenched in Riverside's culture, William Miller wasn't the kind of person anyone crossed lightly. His name carried weight. It appeared on the deed of the sawmill, the town hall's plaque recognizing donors, and just about every project that kept Riverside running. And yet, beneath the shiny veneer of civic responsibility, whispers about William had followed him for years. William Miller had the sort of charisma that could charm strangers and intimidate anyone who dared dig a little deeper. He was tall, broad-shouldered, in his younger days, though now his bulk had softened with age. His signature silver hair was always neatly combed, his suits impeccably tailored, even in a town where jeans and flannel were the uniform. He exuded authority, often joking with townsfolk about the good old days, while brushing off any uncomfortable questions about his family drama or his rumored exploits with women. And there were always women. Women too young, women too vulnerable, or women working for him in precarious roles. He laughed it off, claiming small-town talk had always been his burden, but everyone in Riverside knew where there was smoke, there was fire. When Dillon called William to come down to the police station for questioning, he wasn't surprised that the older man didn't bother acting shaken, confused, or even offended. No, William walked into that room like it was another board meeting, his confidence almost daring Dillon to poke the bear. "Sheriff Dillon," William said, his deep voice carrying an air of authority as he lowered himself into the chair across from Dillon's desk. He met Dillon's piercing blue gaze without flinching. "I suppose you're going to tell me someone's been throwing my name into whatever circus you have going here." Dillon leaned back, deliberately calm and controlled. He'd dealt with men like William before, men who believed they could talk their way out of anything because they always had. But this wasn't the usual small-town dispute about property lines or drunken bar fights. Emily Sanders was dead, and the finger was slowly but surely starting to point toward William Miller. "William," Dillon said, his voice steady, "we've got testimony putting you in regular contact with Emily in the weeks leading up to her death. Late-night meetings, heated arguments. That doesn't exactly line up with the public version of your relationship, does it?" William smirked, leaning back against the cheap chair as though the entire interrogation were a minor inconvenience. "Emily was my daughter-in-law, or she was, at least. We had our disagreements, sure, but family dynamics are messy, Sheriff. I'd think you'd know that." "Oh, I know families can be messy," Dillon replied, keeping his tone conversational while his sharp eyes scanned William's every reaction. "I also know they can get real dangerous when their secrets are on the line." William chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Secrets? Is that what this is about? Listen, Nolan. Can I call you Nolan? You and I both know this town thrives on gossip. Someone's always whispering behind someone's back. I made peace with that a long time ago. But I'll tell you right now, I had nothing to do with Emily's death. It's a tragedy, sure, but I won't sit here and entertain the idea that I'd harm her." "Funny thing is," Dillon cut in, his calm demeanor untouched, "we've got witnesses who say otherwise. Witnesses who saw you meeting her by the guest house late at night. One of them even heard Emily say she wasn't going to keep quiet anymore. What do you suppose she meant by that?" For the first time, a flicker of annoyance crossed William's face. It was fleeting, just a brief tightening of his jaw, but it was enough to convince Dillon he was digging in the right spot. William leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk between them. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, slower, laced with warning. "She was upset. And she liked to say dramatic things when she was upset," William said. "Emily was good at stirring the pot, Sheriff. I'm sure you figured that out by now. But just because she was loud doesn't mean she was telling the truth." Dillon raised an eyebrow, but didn't interrupt. He let William spin his narrative, knowing full well it would only add to the picture he was painting in his own head. Every word, every shift in William's tone, every flicker of irritation, it all helped Dillon see through the facade the older man had perfected over the years. The conversation dragged on, with William skillfully dodging direct admissions of guilt while maintaining his practiced charm. He spun a tale of a patriarch trying to wrangle a family falling apart, dismissing his late-night meetings with Emily as attempts to mediate between her and Joe, or quell her dissatisfaction with Miller family life. Dillon didn't buy it, not entirely, but he kept his cards close to his chest for now. There were bigger questions hanging over William's head, and it was too soon to make his move. What truly concerned Dillon was what forensics was beginning to suggest. Emily had not died of strangulation, as the mark on her neck initially led investigators to suspect. Instead, toxicology results indicated that Emily had been poisoned, with a rare and fast-acting toxin not easily obtained. The staging of the crime scene, combined with the deliberate choice of poison, meant the killer had taken the time to plan this. It wasn't an impulsive act of rage, it was calculated, and it reeked of someone trying to cover their tracks. And if there was one thing Dillon knew about men like William Miller, it was that their tracks often ran much deeper than they let on. As William stood to leave, his body language exuding calm confidence, Dylan watched him closely. The man acted like he was untouchable, like his money and influence could keep the wolves at bay. But Dylan wasn't so easily swayed. He didn't care about wealth, status, or the Miller name. What he cared about was the truth, and he had a gut feeling that William Miller was hiding something big. "Thanks for your time, William," Dylan said as the older man moved toward the door. "But don't get too comfortable. Something tells me we'll be talking again real soon." William paused, his hand resting on the doorknob. He turned slightly, offering Dylan a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Be sure you know what you're doing, Sheriff. Digging too deep into a Miller's life tends to stir up things you might not be ready to handle." As the door closed behind him, Dylan leaned back in his chair, lighting a cigarette he had been saving for moments like this. He exhaled slowly, watching the smoke curl toward the stained ceiling. "Oh, I'm ready, William," he muttered under his breath. "But are you?" The sterile hum of the fluorescent lights in the county forensic lab settled uneasily on Sheriff Dylan's shoulders, mixing with the tension already brewing in his gut. This wasn't his first case involving a suspicious death, but it was rapidly becoming the most puzzling. Emily Sanders' body hadn't just been a discovery, it was a riddle written into every detail of the crime scene. Dylan leaned over the lab counter, his hand gripping a steaming cup of coffee, as Dr. Evelyn Marks, the town's coroner and Riverside's closest thing to a forensic expert, gathered her notes. Her soft click of heels on the tile floor made Dylan glance her way as she approached with a heavy folder tucked under her arm. Dr. Marks wasn't one to mince words, and Dylan appreciated that. She was sharp, mid-40s, perpetually tired but meticulously thorough. If anyone could piece this mess together, it was her. "All right, Evelyn," Dylan said, standing upright as she placed the folder on the table. "What's the story?" She exhaled deeply, tossing her glasses onto the counter. "It's not a simple one, Nolan," she said, using just enough familiarity in her tone to remind him they'd worked together for years. "But I'll say this much. Whoever killed Emily Sanders planned this down to the last detail. It wasn't someone flying off the handle." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle between them. "Premeditated then," Dylan muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. "That doesn't exactly narrow things in a town full of secrets." "And it gets weirder," Dr. Marks interjected, flipping open the folder to reveal an autopsy report littered with highlighted findings and neatly typed comments. "Let's start with cause of death. At first glance I thought it might have been manual strangulation." She pointed toward an image of Emily's neck. "You see the red banding here, those faint bruises? They suggested someone had a strong grip on her neck, but it didn't add up. The pressure wasn't sustained enough to cut off airflow or blood flow to the brain." Dylan narrowed his eyes, studying the photo. "So if it wasn't strangulation, what killed her?" "Poison," she said bluntly, flipping to another page in the file. Dylan's brow furrowed as she continued. "Toxicology results revealed traces of aconitine, a highly toxic alkaloid derived from monkshood plants. You know, those pretty purple flowers people grow in their gardens for show." "This isn't the kind of thing you pick up at the grocery store," Dylan muttered, grimacing. "Someone had to know what they were doing to get their hands on that." Dr. Marks nodded. "Exactly. Monkshood isn't easy to work with. The toxin needs to be extracted carefully, processed into a form that's deadly, and administered in just the right quantity. Too little, and it'll make the victim sick without killing them. Too much, and it's over in a flash, hardly enough time to play out whatever they were planning. The dose used on Emily was precise, methodical." Dylan stared at the report, letting the gravity of the situation sink in. Whoever had killed Emily hadn't done it impulsively. This was careful, calculated, and disturbingly controlled. How'd they get it into her system? Food? Drink? Dr. Marks frowned. "That's the tricky part. We didn't find any significant residue in her stomach contents. Whatever method they used, it bypassed ingestion, but we did find trace amounts of aconitine around her lips and inside her throat, consistent with either direct contact or forced ingestion." Dylan tensed, his mind racing through the implications. "You're saying they might have made her drink it? Or, what, injected it?" "Drinking it seems likely," she said, folding her arms. "Forced ingestion would explain the lack of struggle marks. If they threatened her or manipulated her into drinking it, she might have complied just to protect herself." "Damn," Dylan muttered, pacing the length of the room, his boots squeaking faintly against the linoleum. This wasn't just about killing her then. They wanted it to send a message. "That's not all," Dr. Marks continued, flipping to another page in the folder. "We found DNA from at least 2 other people on Emily's body. One sample matches her husband Joe, which is no surprise given their history, even with the separation. But the other sample? She trailed off, glancing up at Dylan. Don't leave me hanging, Evelyn, he said, leaning closer. Dr. Marks let out a breath. The other sample. It belongs to William Miller. Dylan stopped pacing, his jaw tightening. He shouldn't have been surprised, not after the rumors and Linda Cooper's testimony, but hearing it confirmed hit differently. You're positive? He asked. 100%, she said firmly. We ran it twice. His DNA was found under her nails and there were faint signs of recent sexual activity that match him. Dylan's stomach churned, not at the forensic details but at what they meant. William Miller, the untouchable patriarch of Riverside, wasn't just tangled in this mess, he was standing dead center in it. The faint bruising on Emily's neck, the traces of poison and now the DNA evidence, it painted a picture almost impossible to ignore. Let me guess, Dylan said bitterly. He'll have some neatly packaged story about how his DNA got there, he always does. Probably, Dr. Marks replied. But there's no getting around the poison. Even if he claims he didn't lay a hand on her, the level of planning involved suggests he, or someone close to him, knew exactly what they were doing. Murder by aconitine isn't something you stumble into. Dylan took a long sip of his now cold coffee, his mind working overtime. All right, he said finally, his voice low but resolute. We tighten the net. I want a deep dive into everything tied to William Miller. Financial records, supply orders, hell, even what fertilizer he uses for his garden. Nobody gets their hands on Monkshood extract without leaving a trail. Dr. Marks nodded, though her expression remained cautious. Careful, Nolan. The Miller name carries weight. If you're going after William, you'd better have all your ducks in a row. He won't go down without a fight. Dylan met her eyes, a steely determination settling over his weathered face. I'm not looking for a fight, Evelyn. I'm looking for the truth. That girl's killer thought they could get away with this. They thought wrong. As Dylan left the lab, the autopsy report clutched in one hand, he couldn't stop replaying the findings in his mind. Poison, bruises, staged crime scenes, and now damning DNA evidence. Every piece fit into a haunting puzzle, but the full picture was still just out of reach. One thing, however, was certain. Emily Sanders's death wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. It was something much darker, and Dylan wasn't going to let anyone, not even William Miller, slip through the cracks. Sarah Miller always carried herself with an air of quiet authority. She wasn't loud or brash, but she had a way of making her presence known without ever raising her voice. To the Miller family, and to the people of Riverside, Sarah was the stronghold, the matriarch who kept everything in order. But beneath her polished exterior was an icy presence, a woman who valued legacy and appearances above all else. For Sarah, life was about control, and nothing, not even a daughter-in-law like Emily, was going to disrupt the careful image she had spent decades building. When Sheriff Nolan Dillon sat across from her during a police interview, he felt the weight of her gaze almost immediately. She was poised, too poised for someone who had recently lost her daughter-in-law in a mysterious murder. Her gray hair was impeccably curled, her blouse pressed to perfection, and her manner calm, almost as though this was just another errand to tick off her list for the day. But Dillon had been in law enforcement long enough to know that the most composed people often carried the heaviest burdens. Mrs. Miller, Dillon started, his tone professional but laced with a hint of suspicion. Thank you for coming in today. I know this whole situation must be difficult for you. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap, and gave a small nod. Difficult doesn't even begin to describe it, Sheriff. No mother should have to endure something like this, even if Emily, well, even if she tried my patience at times. There it was. Dillon immediately clocked the subtle jab, a professional way of saying that Sarah didn't like Emily, even in death. I understand. Emily's personality was certainly different from the rest of your family, Dillon said carefully, trying to prod without pushing too hard. She was different, Sarah agreed, her tone crisp. Emily came into Joe's life like a storm. She was brash, opinionated, and reckless. But Joe loved her, so I tolerated her. Tolerated? Dillon raised an eyebrow, leaning forward slightly. That's an interesting choice of words, Mrs. Miller. Were there, specific things about Emily that made you uncomfortable? Sarah hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. It was the only time during the interview that her composure wavered, albeit briefly. She didn't respect boundaries, she didn't respect tradition, and she certainly didn't respect this family's history or values. Dillon sensed that Sarah had something more to say, something heavier weighing down her carefully chosen words. For a moment, the room hung in silence, the faint hum of the overhead lights filling the gap. Finally, Dylan decided to press further. "Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice a notch softer. "We've spoken to some witnesses who suggest there might have been tensions in the house between Emily and other family members, tensions that got worse in the weeks before her death. Can you shed any light on that?" Sarah's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing slightly. For a woman used to controlling her surroundings, the feeling of being boxed in didn't sit well with her. "What kind of tensions are you referring to?" she asked, her voice colder now. Dylan held her gaze evenly. "I'm referring to rumors that Emily wasn't just causing friction in the marriage, but that she might have been involved with someone else in the family. Linda Cooper says she saw Emily and William having private, heated conversations on multiple occasions. And now, Mrs. Miller, I'm asking you, did you know about this?" The room tensed like a wire pulled too tight. Sarah went rigid, her fingers clutching slightly at the hem of her skirt. The name William wasn't even out of Dylan's mouth for a second before Sarah's carefully composed mask cracked just enough to show something unguarded. It wasn't shock, though, it was something darker. Anger. Shame. She exhaled slowly, the sound sharp and deliberate. "Of course I knew," she said finally, her voice clipped. "How could I not? These walls have ears, Sheriff, and as for what Linda saw, she wasn't wrong." Suddenly, the interview room felt smaller. Dylan straightened in his seat, trying to keep his own shock from showing. "You're saying Emily and William?" Sarah shook her head. "There was no relationship, not in that sense. Emily might have been young and foolish, but she wasn't completely stupid. She wanted control, influence, power. And William, well, William was weak, vulnerable to charming little girls who batted their eyelashes just so." Her words oozed disdain, years of tightly coiled bitterness now surfacing. "What exactly did you mean by weak?" Dylan asked, his voice steady but probing. "William thought he could reason with her," Sarah sneered, her cold composure now cracking wide open. "Emily threatened to expose him. She told him she had leverage, secrets about this family she wasn't going to keep to herself if things didn't go her way. And William," Sarah's lip curled slightly, "he dug his grave the moment he started listening to her instead of shutting it down." Dylan took a long breath, his pen still poised over his notepad. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly. You knew about these private conversations. You were aware Emily was threatening William. And in your opinion, William was considering her terms?" Sarah's hands tightened slightly on her lap. "Considering them? No, but William, he's not as strong as he lets people think. I warned him, time and time again. I begged him to stop indulging her, but he didn't listen." "Warned him?" Dylan repeated, his brow furrowing. "Did you ever confront Emily yourself?" Sarah's eyes sharpened, a flicker of something almost venomous passing through them. "I didn't just confront her, Sheriff. I told her very directly that whatever foolish game she was playing, it was going to end. And if she refused, well, there are ways to silence people who don't know when to stay quiet." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Dylan's stomach coiled at the implication. "Are you saying you were involved in Emily's murder, Mrs. Miller?" Sarah leaned forward now, her eyes locking onto Dylan's with deadly precision. "I'm saying I told William to handle his mess. Whether he did or didn't isn't my responsibility. I've spent my life cleaning up after him, after this family. If he couldn't—" She trailed off but didn't finish. She didn't need to. In that moment, Sarah Miller wasn't just the grieving mother-in-law. She was a woman who had been complicit, or at the very least had turned a cold, knowingly blind eye in order to protect the Miller name. It was clear as daylight. Dylan sat back slowly, letting the silence stretch, his mind processing every word she had just said. "Mrs. Miller," Dylan began, quieter now, "you understand these are serious implications. If you advised William in any way that led to harm—" "Don't twist my words, Sheriff," Sarah interrupted, her tone icy again. "I didn't advise anyone to do anything. What I know and what I suspect are two very different things." Dylan didn't respond immediately. His gut told him Sarah Miller knew far more than she was letting on, perhaps even more than William himself. And while she may not have laid a hand on Emily, her involvement was written all over this tangled story. As Sarah rose and prepared to leave, her parting words floated over her shoulder like a final warning. "You want to find the truth, Sheriff? Start with asking William the right questions. But don't forget who really keeps this town running." When the door closed, Dylan leaned back in his chair, staring at the recorder. The matriarch had spoken, and while she wasn't confessing, she wasn't exactly innocent either. Something told him he was standing at the edge of something much bigger than murder. And it all began with a woman who refused to lose control. The interrogation room at the Riverside Police Department was small, sterile, and purposely uncomfortable. The neutral gray walls seemed to close in on William Miller as he sat stiffly in the chair across from Sheriff Dillon. Gone was the confident swagger he had carried with him during their previous encounters. This time, William looked different. His silver hair was slightly disheveled, and even his usual sharp suit seemed less pristine. It was subtle, but Dillon noticed it immediately, a crack in the polished armor of Riverside's most untouchable man. Dillon sat across the table from him, calm but razor-sharp, his notepad open in front of him, though he hadn't written anything yet. He knew this wasn't the moment for detailed notes. This was the moment to watch, to listen, to let silence do the heavy lifting. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the overhead fluorescent lights. William's hands rested on the table, palms down, but there was a slight tremor in his fingers. Dillon leaned forward, his steady blue eyes locking onto William's. "You've been playing this whole situation pretty cool, William," Dillon said, his voice even, almost casual. "But I think we both know that cool won't get you out of this." William didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual, less commanding. "I don't know what you think I've done, Sheriff, but whatever it is, I'm sure you've already decided I'm guilty." "Maybe," Dillon admitted, leaning back slightly. "Maybe not. That's up to you though, isn't it? Some folks in this town idolize you, William, but we both know the people who stand tallest cast the biggest shadows, and when things hide in shadows for too long, they start to rot." "Cut the theatrics, Dillon," William snapped, his voice suddenly sharp. "What do you want from me? You think I killed Emily? Fine, say it. I won't sit here while you fish for something dramatic." Dillon didn't flinch. He reached for the folder sitting next to him and slid it across the table. "It's not about what I think, William, it's about what the evidence says." He flipped open the folder, revealing stark black and white photos of Emily's lifeless form, the bruising on her neck, and the forensic reports about the poison. "And right now, the evidence is pointing at you." William's gaze flicked to the photos but didn't linger. Instead, he let out a sharp exhale, running a hand through his hair. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Dillon leaned forward again, this time with more intent. "Poisoned with aconitine, a toxin that takes precision to handle. And then there's the bruising on her neck, marks that look a hell of a lot like your hand, not to mention your DNA under her nails. You expect me to believe that's all a coincidence?" William didn't answer immediately. There was a long pause, the kind where the room feels like it might collapse under the weight of unspoken words. Finally he straightened his posture and placed his hands firmly on the table, his voice shaking slightly as he spoke. "Fine," William said, his eyes meeting Dillon's with a flicker of anger. "Fine, I grabbed her, I'll admit that much. She pushed me too far. She thought she could control me. Me, of all people, but I didn't kill her." Dillon didn't react right away. He let the words hang in the air, watching William closely. "You're telling me you grabbed her?" he repeated, his voice calm but cutting. "All right, let's start there. Why? What happened?" William's jaw tightened, and for a moment, it seemed like he wouldn't answer. But then, he exhaled slowly as though releasing years of pent-up frustration. "She was blackmailing me," he said flatly. "That's what she did, you know. Emily wasn't the perfect little victim everyone wants to paint her as. She was smart, clever even, but manipulative as hell. She had a way of finding just the right nerve to hit." "Blackmailing you with what?" Dillon asked, though he already had a good idea. "Family secrets," William answered bitterly. "Private things, things that couldn't get out. She knew damn well how much I value this family's name. After all, she was trying to destroy it from the moment she stepped foot on my property." Dillon gave a slow nod. "All right. So she was threatening you. What happened that night?" "She called me," William said after a pause. "Told me we needed to talk. She said she wasn't playing games anymore, that she was going to tell everything. To the press, to the town, to whoever would listen. She said she'd burn the Miller name to the ground if I didn't meet her demands." "And those were?" Dillon pressed. William hesitated, his face hardening. "Money," he admitted finally. "She wanted money. A lot of it. Said it was compensation for the damage the family had done to her." "So, you met her that night?" William nodded. "I went to the guest house. I confronted her. We argued. She kept saying she had the upper hand. She was so smug about it." His tone turned bitter. "I lost my temper, I'll admit that. I grabbed her by the arm, and maybe harder than I should have, but that's it. I left. She was alive when I walked out that door." Dillon studied him for a long moment, letting the silence build again. "That's convenient," he said finally. "She was alive when you left, but dead by morning. And the poison? You're telling me you have no idea about that? No, William said firmly. I didn't poison her. I wouldn't even know how. That's not who I am. Dylan leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. You say you didn't poison her. Maybe you didn't. But you sure as hell had motive, and based on the way you're talking, it sounds like you had plenty of opportunities to do it. William didn't respond immediately. His gaze hardened, and for a moment, it seemed like he was reconsidering everything he had just said. Finally he leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. I made mistakes, Dylan. I made a lot of them, but I didn't kill Emily. If you're looking for a killer, you're barking up the wrong tree. Am I? Dylan shot back. Because everything about this case says otherwise. William shook his head, leaning closer. You want the truth, Sheriff? His voice dropped, almost to a whisper. You're going to find it, but it's not going to be what you think. And when you do, you'll realize that this family... It has more skeletons in its closet than even you can handle. Dylan stared at him, his jaw tightening. That sounds like a warning, William. It's not a warning, William said quietly. It's a fact. The room went silent again, the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. Dylan didn't know whether to believe William's insistence or dig harder into the mountain of evidence pointing straight at him. One thing was clear, though. The confession raised more questions than it answered. As William was escorted out by deputies, Dylan sat alone in the room, staring down at his notepad. He scribbled a single sentence at the top of the page, because if the man was lying, or worse, telling the truth, there was a deeper, darker secret waiting to be uncovered. The clock on Sheriff Dylan's office wall ticked softly, its rhythmic sound out of sync with the storm that raged in his mind. For weeks, the investigation into Emily Sanders' death had felt like chasing shadows, every lead entangling the case deeper in Riverside's darkest secrets. But with threads unraveling, William's confession, Sarah's veiled threats, the damning forensic evidence, it was time to cut through the layers and uncover the truth. And the person Dylan suspected held the key wasn't William. It was Sarah Miller. Dylan had summoned her to his office that afternoon. Unlike the sterile and tactical atmosphere of the interrogation room, this space demanded no scripts, no formalities. It was the sheriff's turf. Personal, cluttered with cases past and present. Sarah sat across from him at the wooden desk, her composure flawless as always. But there was something different in her eyes this time, a spark of defiance, as though she knew this meeting would draw every buried secret into the light. Thank you for coming in, Mrs. Miller, Dylan opened, leaning forward, hands clasped together. His polite demeanor was a facade over the pressure bubbling beneath his skin. I thought it might be easier here, away from... distractions. Sarah tilted her head ever so slightly, her lips curling into what might have passed as a smile under better circumstances. Easier for whom, Sheriff, you or me? Dylan returned the almost smile but didn't break eye contact. For both of us, I'd hope, if the goal is to get to the truth. Ah, the truth, Sarah said softly, her voice dripping with an air of condescension. How noble. Nice try, Dylan replied evenly. You can't intimidate me with that matriarch routine, Sarah. This is about Emily, and I think you know a hell of a lot more than you've been letting on. Sarah adjusted her posture, sitting straighter as if positioning herself for a fight. Let's say I do, Sheriff. What would you like to hear first, the rumors or the facts? I'm interested in both, Dylan said. His gaze sharpened. From what I can piece together, you had just as much of a reason to see Emily silenced as William did. Blackmail, the strain on the family. She was set on exposing everything, wasn't she? Including William's indiscretions. Sarah's jaw twitched. The calculated mask she wore cracked ever so slightly, but her voice remained controlled. William was careless where Emily was concerned, I'll give you that. Emily knew how to manipulate people, particularly weak men like my husband, but her threats... Sarah paused, her glossed nails tapping lightly on the armrest of her chair. Let's just say I wasn't about to let them become reality. Dylan's heart quickened, though his face betrayed nothing. Wouldn't let them? He pressed. That sounds like more than just concern for family reputation. Were you involved in her death? Sarah let out a soft, disdainful laugh. Oh, come now, Nolan, do I look like a murderer to you? You look like someone who's held on to control for a very long time, Dylan countered. He leaned back in his chair, deliberately loosening his posture, but his tone carried the weight of months of suspicion. When a threat that big comes knocking, some people will do anything to make sure their world doesn't come crashing down. For the first time, Sarah's expression shifted into something colder, darker. Emily didn't just knock, Sheriff. She barged in, uninvited, and had the audacity to think she could remodel what she didn't build. Do you know what happens to people like that? Her voice had dropped to a near whisper, the words sharp enough to pierce the silence. No, but I'm sure you're about to tell me, Dylan said, swallowing his unease. Sarah met his gaze steadily. They get themselves into trouble. Every thread they pull unravels something far bigger than they can handle. And what exactly did she unravel? Dylan asked, his voice careful but firm. She learned things, Sarah admitted, her tone now razor-edged. Her hands, normally folded neatly, began to toy with the ring on her finger. About the Millers, about me, she thought those things gave her power, leverage. But what she didn't understand is that power cuts both ways. Leverage, Dylan repeated, his mind connecting dots as fast as Sarah dropped them. I know about the money demands, but you're telling me there was more than just cash? There's always more than cash, Sheriff, Sarah said, her tone equal parts bitter and knowing. Emily didn't just want money, she wanted destruction. She wanted to burn this family to the ground, me included. I couldn't let her do that. So you stopped her, Dylan said, no longer phrasing it as a question. His gut told him he was standing at the edge of a confession. Sarah narrowed her eyes, leaning forward slightly. Do you know what it's like to watch something you've built inch toward collapse? To know everything you've worked for, everything you've sacrificed for, could be destroyed by the betrayal of one person? Her voice shook slightly, the first sign of vulnerability Dylan had ever seen from her. No one in this town understands what the Millers represent. We are the center of this place. Without us, Riverside is nothing. Emily didn't care about that. She wanted all of it. Joseph, William, the money, the name, and when she couldn't have it, she wanted revenge. And you decided to stop her, Dylan repeated, his voice edged with accusation. I did what I had to do, Sarah snapped. Her tone was suddenly fierce, her composure cracking wide open. Don't act like that makes me a monster, Nolan. She was out of control. Dylan sat perfectly still, his hands resting on the edge of his desk. You need to be clear, Sarah. Did you poison Emily? The room was heavy with silence. Sarah's lips parted ever so slightly, her breathing sharper now as if she was weighing her next words carefully. Then, in a tone that was almost too calm, she said, I made her drink the tea. I warned her before. I told her what would happen if she didn't back off. But she didn't listen. Dylan's blood ran cold. He'd come prepared for evasion, for deflection, but to hear Sarah's subtle admission hit harder than he anticipated. So you poisoned her, he said, his voice quieter now, though no less heavy. She made the choice, Sarah countered, her chin lifting defiantly. I told her what was in front of her. She believed she could cheat the consequences. She was wrong. There was no choice, Sarah, Dylan said darkly, leaning forward now, his voice rising slightly for the first time. You killed her. You staged her body like you were wiping a smudge from a damn window. I ensured the continuation of this family, Sarah said, her eyes blazing with conviction. Call it what you want, but it's no different than sweeping out the trash before it clogs the whole system. Dylan's jaw clenched as he stared at her, his thoughts racing. Emily's death wasn't just about blackmail or money, it was about control. About an empire Sarah Miller had built brick by unforgiving brick. She had positioned herself as the protector of a legacy, even if it meant taking another life to do it. You know what happens now, don't you? Dylan finally said, standing up. This legacy you're so desperate to protect, it ends right here. Sarah didn't flinch. She leaned back in her chair as if she'd been expecting this all along. Legacies don't end, Sheriff, she said coolly. They fade, maybe, but they don't end. The courtroom was stifling, the kind of place where the weight of judgment hung in the air like an oppressive fog. Sheriff Dylan sat quietly in the back, his hat resting on his knees, as the judge delivered the sentence. Sarah Miller, Riverside's matriarch, the woman who had ruled over the town's affairs with icy precision, stood at the defense table, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Despite the fall from grace, she held her head high. Her meticulously pressed blazer barely concealed the storm raging beneath her composed exterior. Sarah Jane Miller, the judge's voice echoed through the courtroom, measured and unyielding. For the murder of Emily Sanders, you are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Murmurs spread through the room like wildfire, hushed whispers of disbelief and satisfaction all colliding in the same breath. Dylan clenched his jaw, his gaze fixed on Sarah. She never flinched, never looked back at the spectators. The truth had finally been dragged into the light, but, like everything in this case, it felt less like victory and more like a wound that refused to heal. That evening, Dylan found himself back at his office. the dim light of his desk lamp illuminating the chaos of files, photos, and notebooks strewn across his desk. The case was technically over, but it clung to him like a shadow. He barely noticed when the door creaked open behind him. "Mind if I sit?" The voice was low, familiar, and defeated. Joe Miller. Dylan glanced up, gesturing to the chair across from him. Joe looked like a shell of a man. His once pristine work clothes were wrinkled, his face pale and gaunt. His hands clenched and unclenched on the arms of the chair, the knuckles white from the pressure. "Sarah didn't look at me. Not once," Joe said after a moment. His voice was heavy with anger, but more than that, there was sadness, the kind that comes from realizing too many things too late. "Not after everything. I'm her damn son." "Did you expect her to?" Dylan asked, his voice carefully neutral. Joe shook his head, his thin laugh bitter. "Guess not. She always loved control more than she loved any of us. My whole life, it's been about keeping everything perfect, you know? The family name, the business, the way people see us in this town, it's all such bullshit." Dylan leaned back in his chair, folding his arms as he studied Joe. "Your mother isn't the only one who bought into it, Joe. But you're still here. That counts for something." Joe's gaze darted up, his face tight with emotion. "Does it? Emily's gone. Because of us. She got pulled into this twisted little family and tried to make it out, and look where it got her." "Emily made her choices too," Dylan said, leaning forward now. His voice was steady, but there was no edge to it, only the quiet acknowledgement of truths neither of them could change. "I don't think anyone's hands are clean here. Not yours, not mine. But what matters now is what you do with the rest of your life," Joe scoffed, rubbing his face with both hands. "What life? What's left? Mom's in jail. My dad—" He trailed off, shaking his head with disgust. "He'll die drunk and alone in that big empty house, and me? I'm what, supposed to feel lucky I'm not behind bars too?" "You start over," Dylan said simply. "You leave Riverside, you take what's good in you, and there is good in you, Joe, whether you see it or not, and you go find a place where people don't care about your last name." Joe blinked, as though the thought had only just occurred to him. "Leave?" "Yeah," Dylan said. "Leave. There's nothing here for you anymore except memories that'll kill you a little more every day." "You can't save this place, Joe. Some towns aren't meant to be saved." Joe sat back in silence, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his sleeve. He seemed to be wrestling with something deep inside. Finally he nodded, almost imperceptibly. "Maybe you're right," Joe murmured. "Maybe it's time." As Joe left, Dylan felt a heavy stillness settle over the room. The chair Joe had occupied was still slightly turned, as though waiting for the next broken soul to take its place, but there would be no next soul tonight. Dylan reached for the pack of cigarettes on the edge of his desk. He lit one, letting the acrid smoke fill the air, a quiet rebellion against the weight he couldn't shake. A knock interrupted his thoughts. It was Deputy Taylor, a sheepish look on her face as she stepped inside. "Sheriff," she started, hesitating. "The press is outside again. They want a statement about the Millers." Dylan let out a low, tired laugh. "Of course they do." He paused, staring out the darkened window for a long moment, the town's faint lights twinkling in the distance. "Tell him this. Tell him the truth came out in the end. Tell him sometimes justice doesn't fix things, sometimes it just makes the cracks a little more visible." Taylor frowned but nodded, stepping back out into the fray. A week passed before Dylan drove the winding road up to the Miller estate. The house sat like a corpse on the hill, its pristine windows and garden paths eerily still. William Miller had holed himself up there ever since Sarah's arrest, refusing to talk to anyone. Dylan wasn't entirely sure why he came, maybe just to see if there was anything left to salvage. William answered the door himself, a whiskey glass already in hand. He didn't look surprised to see Dylan, didn't even look irritated. "Sheriff," William drawled, stepping aside to let him in. His voice was hoarse, his usual bravado a faint echo of itself. "Come to kick a man while he's down?" "No," Dylan said evenly, shutting the door behind him. "Just cleaning up loose ends." They sat in silence for a few minutes, the older man nursing his drink while Dylan quietly surveyed the house. It still reeked of wealth and power, but the air felt stale, as though the place had already been forgotten. "You ever think we were cursed, Sheriff?" William asked suddenly, staring down into his glass. "The Millers, I mean. Built all this, controlled all this, but never managed to hold on to what mattered." "You weren't cursed, William," Dylan said flatly. "You just chose the wrong things." William let out a bitter laugh, but there was no fight left in him. "Yeah, I suppose we did." In the end, the Miller legacy didn't crumble so much as it faded into silence. Sarah was gone, and Riverside moved on, though ghosts of the scandal lingered in whispers for years. Joe packed his truck and left the town behind, looking for something, or someone, new to ground him. And William lived out his remaining years alone in his mansion, a man stripped of his family, his power, and the respect he'd once thrived on. As for Dylan, he carried the case with him, like all the others. A quiet, jagged scar on his conscience that would flare up now and then. He told himself Emily had finally gotten justice. But late at night, when the town was still, he couldn't help but wonder, would the truth have come out if Emily hadn't died? If the Millers' secrets hadn't dragged the whole town into their darkness? Sometimes justice came too late, and sometimes it didn't come at all.